In the 18th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, also known as Bedlam in London, became a bizarre and terrifying tourist attraction, drawing large crowds of visitors who came to see mentally ill patients locked up and treated cruelly. On a cold morning, the people of London lined up to pay at the gate, blending in with the crowd, which included ladies, gentlemen, and ordinary citizens, all eager to witness the horrifying scenes inside the hospital. Upon entering, the air was thick with the screams and maniacal laughter of patients imprisoned in dark, small rooms, their hands and feet shackled, a half-naked man with wild eyes, a woman singing fragmented songs from the shadows. These were everyday scenes at Bedlam, where patients lived in extreme deprivation and suffering. Founded in the 13th century, Bethlehem Hospital was one of the oldest mental health institutions in Europe. However, for centuries, it not only served as a place for treating patients, but also became an entertainment spot for the public, with images of mentally ill people being chained and imprisoned. Bedlam gradually became a symbol of chaos and madness in society. Over the centuries, the conditions of the patients at Bedlam never improved, despite being attended to by managers and doctors. Their living conditions remained deplorable. Patients had no freedom, were often restricted in movement, and lacked everything from food to medical care. The treatment here mainly consisted of punishments such as bloodletting, starvation, or cold water baths to calm their madness. By the 18th century, the situation worsened as the public became increasingly indifferent, viewing the mentally ill as a form of entertainment. Every day, Londoners flocked to Bedlam to witness the madness of the patients, unhesitatingly teasing, mocking, and even challenging them to perform bizarre acts to attract attention. From then on, Bedlam was not just a place for imprisoning the insane, but also a place to satisfy the public's curiosity. Bethlehem Royal Hospital, also known as Bedlam, began as a small monastery founded in 1247 in London. Initially, this monastery was not intended for the mentally ill, but rather as a shelter for the poor, the sick, or weary pilgrims. The monastery was built on land donated by Simon Diontford, a local official, and was dedicated to Saint Mary of Bethlehem, hence the hospital's name. In its early years, Bethlehem primarily served as a care facility for the poor, with both spiritual and medical purposes, where monks took care of patients by praying and providing material aid from donations. In its early stage, Bethlehem faced numerous financial difficulties, and for a long time, the hospital survived only on donations from the community. The monks here not only provided medical services, but also ensured the spiritual needs of the patients. However, the financial situation of the hospital was precarious, and it faced many problems related to poverty and deprivation throughout its early years. A significant turning point in Bethlehem's history occurred in 1346, when, during the ongoing 100 Years' War, King Edward I took control of Bethlehem due to its association with a French religious organization. The king decided to seize Bethlehem to stop donations from flowing into enemy hands. After this event, the hospital became more secular and gradually transitioned from being managed by the monks to being under the control of the city government of London. By the 15th century, Bethlehem began to emerge as a treatment facility for the mentally ill. A report in 1403 noted that the hospital had started admitting individuals described as meaning insane. This was the first indication that Bethlehem was no longer just caring for the poor, but was beginning to focus on treating those with mental disorders. However, the treatment at Bethlehem was still very rudimentary. primarily consisting of imprisonment and control. Mentally ill patients were often chained or locked in small, dark rooms and subjected to management methods such as stocks and handcuffs. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, Bethlehem continued to maintain its role as a place for confining the mad, and the methods of treatment showed little change. The treatment was mainly punitive, using chains and shackles to restrain the patients. The monks and hospital staff were not trained doctors, but unqualified managers who often relied on harsh methods to control the patients. By the late 16th century, Bethlehem had become a well-known landmark in London, not only for its role in imprisoning patients, but also for its strange reputation within the community. The patients, especially those poor and destitute, became subjects for the public to come and see, sometimes simply for entertainment. The people of London viewed it as an amusement park where they could observe and even mock the patients in their insane states. During this period, the brutal scenes and the deprivation of the living conditions of the patients at Bedlam further cemented its place as a symbol of chaos and injustice in society. Since the early 15th century, Bethlehem had gradually formed a negative image in society, although initially the hospital was simply a temporary care facility for the poor. Over time, with changes in management and its purpose, it became one of the first mental hospitals in Europe, with extremely poor living conditions. The patients, locked in small rooms, lived in deprivation and under the cruelty of their managers, reflecting the helplessness and ignorance of society at the time regarding mental health issues. By the end of the 14th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or Bedlam, began transitioning from a hospital for the poor to a facility for the treatment of mental patients. By 1403, the hospital had admitted at least 6 patients described as menti, meaning insane. In reports from a royal inquiry, this marked the first documented instance of the hospital actually caring for individuals with mental health issues. However, treatment at Bethlehem remained primitive and lacked expertise. During this period, mental patients were mainly managed through coercive measures such as leg irons, handcuffs, and confinement in dark, deprived rooms. The treatment primarily consisted of isolating patients and keeping them away from society, while the monks running the hospital had no medical knowledge. They largely relied on traditional methods like prayer and religious rituals to treat patients. In reality, many patients were simply confined without receiving adequate medical care. In the 15th century, Bethlehem began to emerge as a public spectacle, attracting attention not only for its treatment efforts, but also for the strange and brutal scenes the hospital offered. Londoners, particularly the poor and those intrigued by the bizarre, visited Bethlehem to see the mentally ill, sometimes just for entertainment. Patients, shackled or confined to small rooms, became subjects for the public to watch and mock. This further boosted Bethlehem's notoriety, but also made it a symbol of cruelty and society's ignorance of mental illness. Additionally, Bethlehem faced significant financial difficulties and poor management. The doctors and hospital administrators were mostly unqualified, and at times they were not capable of managing the increasing number of patients. The treatment was often ineffective, and coercive measures like chaining patients, locking them in dark rooms, or ostracizing them remained the primary methods for controlling those with mental disorders. From the 15th to the 16th century, Bethlehem continued to be managed by London city officials. Although the hospital had begun admitting mental patients early on, the quality of care remained severely limited. The living conditions for patients were still abysmal. Patients lived in squalor, without enough food, adequate housing, or proper medical care, the financial constraints prevented the hospital from improving conditions for patients, and the unhygienic and miserable state of the patients persisted for centuries. Bethlehem Hospital became a symbol of neglect and cruelty toward those with mental disorders in society during that period. Despite the hardships and poor care, Bethlehem continued to exist as a treatment facility for centuries, becoming part of the history of medicine and psychology. Although most of the treatment methods at the time were ineffective, by the end of the 16th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam continued to face challenges in treating mental patients. Even though the hospital had come under the management of London city officials, after Bethlehem transitioned from the management of the monks to the city authorities, the living conditions and patient care at the hospital showed little improvement. The hospital continued to employ primitive and brutal methods for managing patients, where most were simply confined without receiving proper medical care. Although Bethlehem had begun admitting more mental patients, the hospital lacked the medical expertise to effectively treat these cases. The treatment methods remained largely coercive, such as chaining patients to the walls or locking them in dark rooms. Patients at Bedlam were not only imprisoned, but also subjected to harsh punishments. With no medical interventions or in-depth psychological care, instead of attempting to treat the patients, the hospital simply kept them away from society. In the 17th century, Bedlam became a famous destination for the public, but not for medical purposes or treatment improvements. On the contrary, Bedlam attracted the public's attention as a performance of cruelty, where people could visit to witness mentally ill patients being shackled and locked in small rooms. These patients were not given proper care, but were treated as objects for public curiosity. Particularly in the 17th century, Bethlehem experienced a severe crisis in its management. One of the major scandals occurred when Dr. Helia Crook was appointed as the chief physician and hospital manager in 1619. Despite having good relations with the royal family, Crook was a corrupt and incompetent manager. Under his leadership, the quality of patient care significantly declined. Crook was accused of embezzling patient fees, leading to the patients being starved and living in terrible conditions. An inspection in 1631 discovered that patients at Bethlehem were not only starving, but also living in filthy and deprived conditions. Eventually, due to the scandals and poor management, Crook was dismissed in 1632. After this event, Bethlehem began implementing some reforms in the way it was managed and how patients were cared for. A new system was established, and instead of having a single manager, the hospital now had a team of doctors and nurses to care for the patients. However, even with changes in the management structure, the living conditions of patients at Bedlam still did not improve significantly. Throughout the 17th century, patient treatment at Bethlehem remained largely based on harsh and inhumane measures. Doctors and hospital administrators used methods like purging, bloodletting, and cold baths to calm the patients. These methods were not only ineffective, but also exacerbated the patient's conditions. In some cases, patients were locked in dark rooms or forced to endure isolation for extended periods, which further worsened their psychological condition. Bethlehem, under the management of doctors without formal medical expertise, became a place where mental patients lived in pain, deprivation, and indifference. Despite some small reforms at the end of the 17th century, Bethlehem remained an inhumane facility lacking scientific and compassionate treatment methods. Instead of providing the necessary medical and spiritual care for patients, Bethlehem continued the model of confinement and neglect. making it increasingly a symbol of cruelty toward those with mental disorders. In the 18th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam became a prominent symbol of cruelty toward those with mental illness. After transitioning to the management of the city authorities of London, the conditions at Bedlam not only failed to improve but worsened. The hospital became a bizarre entertainment spot for the public. Every day, thousands of Londoners visited to witness the suffering of the mental patients, who were shackled to the walls or confined in dark rooms. This spectacle made Bedlam a kind of performance for public curiosity, where patients were treated as strange exhibits, providing a brutal form of entertainment for the onlookers. By the mid-18th century, it became common for the public to visit the hospital, especially on weekends and during holidays. People from all walks of life would visit Bedlam to observe the mentally ill patients, sometimes taunting them for humorous effect. The patients became objects for the public to gaze at, mock, and even provoke, further intensifying their suffering. Although Bedlam had some physical improvements in the 17th century, with the construction of a new building to house 100 to 120 patients, the condition of the patients remained unchanged. The mentally ill were still confined to separate rooms, not allowed to move freely, and were treated as slaves within the hospital. The hospital continued to employ cruel treatment methods, such as chaining patients, keeping them in darkness, and using brutal punishment. Notably, in 1751, a new mental hospital named Luke's opened its doors and adopted more humane treatment methods, not allowing the public to visit. The establishment of Luke's provided a stark contrast to Bedlam, highlighting the backward and inhumane treatment methods of the latter. Treatment methods such as diagnosing patients with compassionate care, using music therapy, and engaging in activities to help with mental recovery began to be implemented at other institutions, but Bedlam persisted in maintaining its brutal practices. The public gradually recognized the injustice at Bedlam, and the authorities began to take steps toward reform. However, these changes were slow and not strong enough to significantly improve the situation. Bedlam remained a symbol of cruelty toward those with mental illness, and only in the following centuries, as medicine and mental health treatments advanced, did Bedlam begin to shift toward more humane practices. In the mid-18th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam continued to maintain a dreadful reputation in London society. The hospital became a place despised and associated with cruelty toward mental patients. Despite the improvement in facilities, when it moved to a new building capable of housing 100 to 120 patients, the conditions for patients there did not improve significantly. Bedlam still maintained the practice of managing patients like prisoners, restricting their freedom and treating them with cruelty, without proper medical care. In fact, patients continued to live in isolation, confined to locked rooms, with no access to communal spaces. At the same time, Luke's Hospital opened in 1751, offering a new, more humane form of treatment, and it did not allow the public to visit. Luke's adopted new treatment methods, including treating patients with compassion and aiding their recovery through music and therapeutic activities. This created a stark contrast with Bedlam, where patients continued to be treated as strange objects for public entertainment. Although there were some changes in the management of the hospital, and attention began to be paid to more humane treatment methods from other institutions, Bedlam still could not escape its notorious reputation as a symbol of cruelty toward those with mental illness for many centuries. It was only when medicine advanced and treatment methods improved that Bedlam began to gradually change. By the end of the 18th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam continued to face criticism for its cruelty and inhuman treatment of patients. Although the hospital had undergone some changes in its facilities, including moving to a larger building in 1676, the treatment methods showed no significant improvement. Patients at Bedlam were still confined to dark, deprived rooms, with most of them shackled or restricted in their movements. Medical care remained rudimentary and lacking compassion. The doctors and hospital staff had insufficient knowledge of psychiatric medicine and continued to use cruel treatment methods like bloodletting, purging, and cold baths. Nevertheless, the late 18th century marked a shift in societal views on mental illness and the treatment of those suffering from it. A clear example of this was the establishment of St. Luke's Hospital in 1751, which began to implement more humane treatment methods. Unlike Bedlam, Luke's did not open its doors to the public for entertainment purposes. Instead, the hospital focused on treating mental patients through methods such as music and therapeutic activities, encouraging interaction and mental recovery. The founding of St. Luke's highlighted a stark difference between the two hospitals. Bedlam, with its notorious reputation, continued to maintain its brutal treatment methods that caused harm to the patients. Although the public became more aware of the injustice and cruelty of Bedlam, they still continued to visit the hospital to witness the spectacle of mentally ill patients being shackled and imprisoned. Bedlam had become a place to satisfy public curiosity, rather than a genuine medical care facility. Despite some minor reforms at the end of the 18th century, Bedlam still could not escape societal criticism. The authorities and medical reformers began to realize that the hospital needed to change to align with the advancements in medicine and psychiatric treatment. However, this change occurred very slowly and was not strong enough to significantly improve the living conditions of patients at Bedlam. Bethlehem Hospital, despite having existed and evolved over many centuries, remained a symbol of inhumanity toward those with mental illness for a long period. The deprivation, abuse, and cruel treatment methods made Bedlam a prominent example of the cruelty toward mental patients in history. Although the hospital later saw minor reforms and gradually moved toward more humane practices, the dark years of Bedlam remain an unforgettable part of medical history, reminding us of the cruelty of the past and the important lessons on how to treat mental patients. In the 19th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam continued to exist as a mental health facility, but the situation began to change after centuries of brutal and inhumane management. Although the hospital had moved to a new building at Moorfields in 1676, the living conditions of the patients still did not improve significantly. They were still confined to small, deprived rooms and closely monitored, without any real medical care. However, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a wave of reforms in the field of medicine and mental health treatment began to take shape, completely changing the way mental patients were treated. One of the key events in this reform process was the founding of St. Luke's Hospital in 1751, which applied more humane treatment methods and did not allow the public to visit. Luke's focused on treating mental patients using less brutal methods, such as music therapy, occupational therapy, and activities that help patients reintegrate into society. These methods created a stark contrast with Bedlam, where the public was still allowed to visit the hospital and mock the patients. Although Bedlam also began to realize the need for change, the hospital continued to maintain many outdated treatment methods, such as bloodletting, purging, and cold baths. These methods remained ineffective in treating mental illness and could even harm the patients. Bethlehem continued to maintain its image as a cruel place, where patients were not treated as individuals with rights, but as objects for the public to watch and satisfy their curiosity. Only when major reforms in the 19th century began to influence society and medicine did Bethlehem begin to see real changes. Humane treatment methods, such as moral treatment, were implemented. This movement sought to replace punitive measures with caring treatment, using methods such as music, labor therapy, and activities to help patients recover and reintegrate into the community. Although Bethlehem continued to employ traditional treatment methods for a long time, these reforms started to change the way patients were managed. By the mid-19th century, the hospital gradually reduced the use of measures like chaining patients and replaced them with less brutal methods. Patients were gradually allowed to move freely within the hospital and participate in therapeutic activities. Although there were still many challenges, Bethlehem began to apply more progressive treatment methods, in line with the trends of medicine and society at the time. By the late 19th century, Bethlehem had gradually become a more modern mental health facility. Although there were still issues with living conditions and the quality of care, the hospital's gradual adoption of new methods and reforms was a testament to the changing societal views on mental illness and the people suffering from it. However, this change was very slow and incomplete, and Bethlehem remained linked with the painful memories of the history of mental health treatment. Nonetheless, by the end of the 19th century, Bethlehem had begun making significant strides, transforming from a symbol of cruelty to a medical institution with more humane reforms. At the beginning of the 20th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam began to transform from a symbol of cruelty toward mental patients into a more modern healthcare facility. Although its history remained filled with tragic events, having existed for over 600 years, Bedlam was now moving toward becoming a part of the national mental health care system. Despite its past filled with abuse and inhumanity, the hospital began to undergo positive changes, thanks to advancements in medicine and social reforms in the treatment of mental illness. One of the key turning points in this transformation was the hospital's takeover by the National Health Service, ends in 1948. This not only brought a change in management, but also helped improve the living conditions of the patients. Under the AS's supervision, Bedlam was gradually renovated into a higher quality mental health facility, with the goal of helping patients recover and reintegrate into society, rather than simply imprisoning them. One important aspect of Bedlam's reform was the introduction of new treatment methods, including medication and psychological therapies. In the 1950s, antipsychotic drugs such as chlorpromazine were introduced and widely used, helping patients reduce anxiety and severe psychiatric symptoms. This not only stabilized patients, but also opened up the possibility of more effective mental health treatment without resorting to the harsh punitive measures of the past. In addition, psychological therapies began to be applied. The hospital implemented group therapy and talk therapy, where patients could discuss their issues and work on improving their psychological conditions under the guidance of professionals. This allowed patients to not only receive medical treatment, but also have the opportunity to reintegrate into society. Along with the changes in medical treatment, the living environment of the patients at Bedlam was also significantly improved. The patient rooms became cleaner and more comfortable, with dedicated areas for recreation and relaxation. Patients were no longer confined to dark rooms, but were encouraged to engage in activities like art, exercise, or gardening, which contributed to their better mental and physical well-being. although the reforms in the early 20th century were not complete and many issues remained. Change had begun to take shape. Harsh practices such as chaining patients, ostracism, and the use of coercive measures nearly disappeared entirely. By the end of the 20th century, Bedlam had evolved into a modern mental health facility with psychiatrists, therapists, and highly skilled medical staff. In recent years, Bedlam has transformed into a psychological research and mental health treatment center, participating in advanced studies on mental disorders and their treatment. The experts here not only treat patients, but also conduct research into new therapies, helping improve the quality of life for those with mental health issues. Although Bedlam's past remains a lesson in the cruelty of how patients were treated, this transformation shows that over the course of history, medicine and society have gradually improved the treatment and care of those with mental illnesses. Bedlam, with its significant changes over more than 800 years, is no longer a symbol of cruelty, but has become a center for treatment, research, and the improvement of mental health, moving toward a more humane and scientific future. By the end of the 20th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam underwent a powerful transformation, shifting from a facility notorious for its cruelty toward mental patients to a more modern medical center for treatment and research. Although its long history was filled with brutal treatment methods and horrific scenes, with the development of medicine and social reforms, Bedlam gradually became a psychiatric hospital that met humane and scientific standards. A major turning point in this transformation was when Bedlam was incorporated into the UK's National Health Service, NAS, in 1948. This was a significant milestone, as joining the ERS not only provided the hospital with public funding, but also brought it under the strict supervision of health authorities, completely changing the way the hospital operated. Instead of continuing to use outdated and inhumane treatment methods, Bedlam began to adopt modern medical practices and new patient care methods, improving their quality of life. In the mid-20th century, the introduction of tranquilizers, such as chlorpromazine, revolutionized the treatment of mental illness. These medications helped control symptoms of mental disorders, from anxiety and delusions to depression, without resorting to measures like shackling or ostracism. The use of tranquilizers reduced the cruelty that had been applied at the hospital for centuries and opened up a new approach to treating mental illness. Alongside improvements in medication, psychological therapies began to be applied. Under the supervision of the ERS, Bedlam started offering group and individual therapy sessions, where patients could talk, share their emotions, and work on overcoming psychological challenges. Psychiatrists no longer simply treated patients with medication, but also helped improve their mental health through psychological therapies and participation in community activities. In addition to improving medical treatment, the living environment for patients at Bedlam was also significantly upgraded. Patient rooms were no longer cramped and dirty, but had been renovated into spacious, clean, and more comfortable spaces. Patients were no longer confined to dark rooms. Instead, they were encouraged to participate in activities like art, exercise, or gardening, which helped improve their mental and physical well-being. Areas such as gardens, meeting rooms, and common spaces were built so patients could interact with each other, work in groups, and reduce their sense of isolation, ultimately improving their quality of life. This reflected a major shift in society's view of mental patients. Previously, people with mental illness were seen as strange, frightening, and often ostracized. However, by the end of the 20th century, this perception gradually changed. Mental patients were no longer viewed as mad, but as individuals who needed medical and emotional support to recover. This marked a recognition that mental illness was not a sign of weakness or punishment, but a medical condition requiring treatment and care. In the 1980s and 1990s, Bedlam continued to reform and adopt more advanced treatment methods. Doctors and medical staff at Bedlam not only cared for patients physically, but also focused on their mental recovery and helping them reintegrate into society. The hospital became a center for psychological research, where experts studied and experimented with new treatments for mental disorders. However, this improvement was not an easy process. Bedlam still faced many challenges, especially in terms of finances and manpower. Changes in society and medicine were gradual, and not every patient could benefit from these reforms at all times. Nevertheless, Bedlam's gradual shift from a place of confinement to a center for care and medical research was a clear testament to the changing approach toward mental patients over the centuries. By the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, Bedlam became a part of the modern healthcare system in the UK, where mental patients were treated with scientific, humane, and more effective methods. The hospital is now not only a care facility, but also a place for research and development of advanced treatment methods. Bedlam, once a landmark known for its cruelty, gradually became a symbol of progress in mental health care, reminding us that while the painful past cannot be forgotten, it serves as motivation to build a better future for those with mental illnesses. By the end of the 20th century, Bethlehem Royal Hospital Bedlam, which had been famous for its long history of cruelty toward mental patients, underwent a powerful transformation. From a place that imprisoned and mistreated individuals with mental illnesses, Bedlam gradually evolved into a modern medical treatment facility, with significant reforms in the care and treatment of patients. This change reflected the development of medicine and changes in societal attitudes toward mental illness, and those who suffer from it. One of the key turning points in this transformation was when the hospital was incorporated into the UK's National Health Service in 1948. Joining the ERS not only provided a stable source of funding, but also allowed Bedlam to access modern treatment methods. With close supervision from healthcare authorities, in the past, Bedlam was a place where brutal treatments, such as chaining patients, locking them in dark rooms, and using punitive measures to control them, were common. However, joining the ERS created an opportunity for the hospital to change, improving the living conditions and the quality of care for patients. In the mid-20th century, the development of tranquilizers revolutionized the treatment of mental illness. Chlorpromazine, one of the first tranquilizers, helped control the symptoms of severe mental illnesses, such as anxiety, delusions, and depression, without resorting to brutal measures. The use of tranquilizers helped reduce the patient's distress and created a safer treatment environment for them. This was an important step in replacing coercive measures and allowed patients to recover and reintegrate into society more effectively. In addition to advances in medication, psychological therapies also began to be applied at Bedlam. Doctors and therapy specialists began focusing on providing psychological therapy for patients, not just physical treatment. Methods such as talk therapy, group therapy, and other therapeutic activities were introduced to help patients address their psychological issues and improve their mental well-being. These therapies created a safe and supportive space where patients could share their emotions, seek help, and begin the process of psychological recovery. The living environment for patients at Bedlam also changed dramatically. After joining the ERS, The hospital underwent renovations with more spacious, clean, and comfortable living areas. Patient rooms were no longer cramped and dark, but were equipped with basic amenities. Common areas, meeting rooms, and recreational spaces were built so that patients could interact with each other, engage in group activities, and improve their mental well-being. Bedlam was no longer a place of isolation and segregation, but an open space where patients could reintegrate into society and lead a better quality of life. More importantly, the hospital's incorporation into the NAS marked a major shift in how society viewed and treated mental patients. In the past, people with mental illnesses were often ostracized by society, seen as mad and incapable of reintegrating into social life. They were abandoned in hospitals like Bedlam, where they received inadequate care and often suffered abuse. However, by the end of the 20th century, societal perceptions began to change. Mental patients were no longer viewed as frightening or excluded from society. Instead, they were seen as individuals who needed medical and emotional support to recover. This signified a recognition that mental illness was not a sign of weakness or punishment, but a medical condition that needed to be treated and cared for. With the shift in societal perception, Bedlam also began to adopt new treatment methods, particularly moral treatment, a therapeutic approach that replaced harsh, punitive measures with compassionate care, offering patients the opportunity to reintegrate into society. These new treatment methods not only helped reduce mental illness symptoms, but also allowed patients to regain their self-confidence and hope for life. This transformation was not an easy process. Bedlam had existed for centuries with a painful and tragic history, and changing old habits was not a simple task. However, the reforms of the 20th century helped Bedlam gradually transition from a place of confinement to a more modern and human psychiatric hospital. The use of tranquilizers, psychological therapies, and humane treatment methods allowed the hospital to regain trust and become an important center for medical treatment and research. Ultimately, Bethlehem Royal Hospital, once a symbol of cruelty and injustice, became a symbol of progress in the treatment of mental illness, with significant changes throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. The hospital became an important part of the national mental health system, continuing to research and develop new treatment methods while providing patients the opportunity to live better lives and reintegrate into society.